This portion of Lee Pitts Live is brought to you by Hodges University, educating the leaders of our community for over 20 years.
Welcome back, Southwest Florida. We're so delighted to get this wonderful author in here who's written an outstanding book. The name of the book is America. Put it up on the screen for me, Rick. African Love, Making the Connection. Tishana. Good job with that book. And the book talks about Africa. You can take it down, Rick. Africa, the Caribbeans, particularly Jamaica, and African Americans, and how all of that mix comes together. So we have the author here, Tishana. Welcome to the show.
Nice to meet you.
Good get here. You're before we get into your book, you're actually in law school, I think.
Yes, I'm finishing law school, and I actually take my final exam on tomorrow.
Okay, so all that law stuff gives you some good writing skills. First of all, I want to say I really enjoy reading your book, and one of the things that stood out to me in the book is the detail. Fortunately for me, I've traveled throughout the Caribbean, and I've also been to Africa. I don't know if you know that. I haven't specifically been to Nigeria, but you spend a lot of time talking about Nigeria, and I think that may have something to do with the fact that you're married to a Nigerian.
Yes, it does. Yes, it
does.
Go
from there.
Well, basically, the book is a witty account of a young woman who's originally from Jamaica and travels to Nigeria, and she discovers a lot about herself. In the process of discovering love, she discovers some cultural issues, and she makes certain connections between, like you said, the African American culture, the Jamaican culture, and the Nigerian or West African culture.
Mm-hmm. Now, I have not read a similar book. So when I was reading the book, I was saying to myself, wow, she's really hit a gold mine here. I'm so glad somebody is actually taking time out to put this in writing. What was your approach to the book? What were you trying to accomplish?
Basically, it came out of my own ignorance. I remember one of the first things I did when I went to Nigeria was I asked the question of somebody. I was like, so where are all the animals? And they like looked at me and said, in the zoo, of course. Right, you know, because you always have this image of, you know, Africa just being wildlife and, you know, animals running around everywhere. So that sparked the inspiration, because so many people like myself are so ignorant to Africa, even though we're of African descent. We know very little about the culture.
And that's unfortunate, and of course I got the same experience when I was in South Africa. I said, where they, you know, I knew better, but I still want to see some of the animals, and they actually took me to the zoo, or they took me out to the place where all the animals run free, these parks for that. So now, you know, and that kind of thing. But the food, the hair, the culture, the music, the way people, family, all of those things still remain present even in modern day African Americans and in the people in the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica. Go ahead and talk about that and how you go about that in the book.
Yeah, because one of the amazing things was just, I'm originally from Jamaica, and even the food, it was so amazing that there's so many foods that were originally brought, you know, from Africa to the West Indies and also to America. There were, of course, different names for them, but you got to see the similarities, whether it's in soup. One of the most interesting things is even the gumbo tradition and the gumbo soups of Louisiana, per se, is so similar to the way that West Africans prepare their soup. And just making that link, you know, you realize that there is that connection, because so often in American society, there's almost like an effort to kind of separate African Americans from their original context, and it's important to keep that origin, because a people without a past have no future.
I would say that has improved. African Americans have become more aware of their connection to Africa, but there's a lot needs to take place there. Now, when you're looking in, when you were looking at the Middle Passage or the Triangle Trade of how the Africans came from Nigeria and were dropped off in Jamaica, and then the ships traveled on to the United States continent and so on and so forth. What, in that triangle, what are some key things that you think were lost in the process?
I think what was lost is just that connection, because I remember as a child in Jamaica, we were always taught about our history in terms of the Middle Passage, but there's a difference between being taught history and actually seeing those similarities and seeing how those connections are made. For instance, even in the way that one of the things I address was the black male swag, and that's, you know, it goes back even just observing the African male, how he presents himself, how he graces, how he, when he enters a room, just that presence. And you could see that even with the young guys on the streets in the African American context. You could see that with Jamaican guys, for instance. Usain Bolt, just look at Usain Bolt after he wins a medal, just how he's so charismatic and how, you know, he just exudes just that amount, that character, and that's part of that existence, that, but we don't make that connection, and then that does come from somewhere.
And the bottom line, there's no swag like the swag of a black man. Okay, we're not going to go to any breaks, Diane. The things that you talked about that I think particularly as it relates to Nigeria and how some of the humbleness might have gotten lost in the process, now becoming more materialistic in terms of cars and money and house and bling bling. Talk about that and how you dealt with it in the book.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, because especially with American culture is extremely strong, especially through hip-hop culture. Hip-hop culture has influenced the entire world. You know, when I go back to Jamaica, I turn on the Jamaican TV, I see more hip-hop videos than reggae videos, you know. And the same thing with in Nigeria. It was so funny. I was in some of the most remote northern part where, you know, very strict Muslim communities, and I saw this one guy and he's listening to Tupac, and, you know, it's just amazing how just that influence, but with that influence, you know, comes some of the negativity, because, you know, hip hop glorifies a lot of the money and the cars and things like that, and because of that, many people are looking to a lot of the materialism, and a lot of the cultural values are being lost in this whole need to kind of amass as much money, amass as much cars, well, to attract women. And that comes from that, just that, you know, kind of perception that everything's about money and materialism. So that has negatively influenced the culture.
And we have a phone number and a website on the screen where people can go to actually get a copy of the book. Let's have you read an excerpt from the book, and while you're preparing to read that excerpt from the book, I would tell people this is a great book, and you certainly need to call that number or go to that website and get more detail.
Yes. As we continued, I remember what people had said before my trip. Some call Nigeria the Jamaica of Africa. I called it home, or at least to myself, I called it home. I realized that I didn't need to take so many pictures of people. Except for a few churches and oil refinery companies, it was no different from my homeland. The roads, the vehicles, the people, the smiles, the children, the dirt roads, the marketplaces, the shops, all reminded me of home sweet home. I marveled at the day-to-day living. Given all the Eurocentric views, I had expected a bunch of uncivilized human beings dying from HIV or AIDS, not children on their way to schools, businessmen and women off to work, taxi men trying to make a living, and young people just living and enjoying life.
That capsulized a lot of things and misperception. Excellent. The idea that you can take, well, when you go to the Caribbeans, I noticed in the Caribbeans that a lot of the African traditions are still there. They're slowly watering away, but they're more prevalent than they are to the Black Americans who were in slavery a lot longer and was trying to assimilate more. Talk about why that didn't take place as much in the islands in terms of losing some of those good values that came from Africa.
Because one of the values that I'll highlight is like even the concept of carnival. A lot of people think carnival, think Brazil, and of course a lot of the African traditions are very strong in Brazil, but that comes from New Year's celebration that started in West Africa and came across as just celebration of dancing and fun, but a lot of those traditions go deeper. In terms of why there wasn't that watered down processes, even looking at the population of the West Indies, most of the African populations remained intact, whereas with the U.S., at a certain point when the African population started to outnumber the European population, there were systematic controls put in place to actually limit the population, and that's the difference, because there was actually controls set in to say, you know, let's limit how many, you know, African slaves are born, and so that decreased the amount of indigenous people from Africa, whereas with the Caribbean, the majority of the population, for example, in Jamaica, 75% are of direct African descent. In Trinidad, it's like half and half. So just that the sheer numbers and just that proliferation of culture was what kind of maintained that African connection as opposed to the U.S.
Okay, we've kind of gone over, Rick. Let's just continue to roll on this. The when people read your book, what do you hope that they take from the book? Final question.
I hope that we all, regardless of race, regardless of gender, realize that we all come from a common ancestry. You know, it's evident, and you know, science has proven it. We all come from that same woman found in Africa. So we all share a common heritage and a common history. And with any culture, if you look farther enough, it all brings you back to the same place. So.
Excellent. Well, I really enjoyed the book, and continued success with the book, and keep up the good work, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, stay right there. As the saying goes on this particular show, for those who say it can't be done, they are usually interrupted by those like this fine author and all the people who are associated with her book who are doing it. We'll see you next week on Leap Is Live.